Please give a warm welcome to the host of Broadway Buzz, Mr. Joe Gary.
Thank you very much, and welcome to Broadway Buzz, and welcome to MJ. MJ is one of the most successful musicals on Broadway right now. It has generated over $200 million, takes in over $1 million a week. It's a spectacular production, and it is, of course, a tribute to the genius of Michael Jackson. He was born in 1958. He died in 2009, 50 years old, tragic death. He died of a medical overdose of a narcotic that is used to put a patient under for surgery. It was administered by a doctor, tragically, who faced criminal charges. So it was a life that was led in the spotlight from the time he was a tiny child. He beguiled us with his brilliance, his talent, his innocence, his musicality, his dance ability. He was an extraordinary artist right at the very beginning. There is a sort of irony to Michael Jackson. Even as a tiny child, Dionne Warwick told this wonderful story that she met him very early on, and he sang at her birthday party, and he was so electric. I mean, she realized she was in the presence of a great artist, and he was 10 years old. But when she spoke to him off stage, he was so quiet and so shy that she couldn't quite put together those two personalities, the onstage Michael Jackson, who was electric and compelling, and then there was the offstage shy, withdrawn Michael. That would continue all of his life. You will see that brilliantly presented when you see the show. When he died, 2.5 billion people watched the memorial service on television. It was like the end of an era, the end of an icon. He was clearly the king of pop. No question about that. He would change music. He would change dance. He would change fashion. He would be one of the great philanthropists of the age. And he would break every record in every stadium that he played in, literally around the world. He quite simply had to be the best. But he became the best at great cost. As you remember in his life turned very dark. And there were accusations of sexual abuse. There was a sensational trial that happened. Actually, he was acquitted in that particular trial, but the accusations continued until his death. He was forced actually to leave the country and live in exile in Bahrain for a period of time. So this very tormented life. Be careful what you wish for because it may come true. I mean, he was so phenomenally successful that he couldn't really have a life. He would have 3 children, as you know, Prince, Paris, and Blanket. He would take his youngest child, Blanket, and when he was in Germany at one point, there was a sensational moment when he wanted to show the media his baby, and he hung the baby, holding him by his arms, over a balcony 4 stories above the photographers. And of course, it generated this terrible image of him as a parent. He was apparently very loving and very devoted, but the onstage persona and the offstage persona got very mixed up at the end of his life. And it was a great tragedy. Okay, so let's go back and let me trace this life for you, and then I'll show you how brilliantly the musical deals with his life. As I said, he was born in 1958 in Gary, Indiana. He was the 8th of 9 children. There was a 10th child who was a twin that died in childbirth. So there were 9 siblings. There were 6 boys and 3 girls, all of them enormously talented. As young children, they would become the Jackson 5. But let me just go back and fill in some other earlier backgrounds that are really very important to his life. His father, Joe, wanted to be a boxer. He fell in love with a young woman, Catherine. They married. They would become the parents and create the dynasty of the Jacksons. She was a very serious Jehovah's Witness, very religious woman. She worked in Sears. They led a very simple life. His ambitions of being a boxer, obviously, were put aside when they started having multiple children very quickly. And the end result was that Joe then created a music group, and he performed. So the basis of all of the Jackson talent really comes from both parents. The mother was an established singer, and she played a musician. She played the clarinet and other instruments. So music was always very much a part of the family. And Joe literally had a pop group where he tried to perform. He worked in the steel mills to support his family. They lived in a small 2-bedroom bungalow. And again, in the area they lived in, it was a rather transitional area. So Joe had to be very careful that his children weren't caught up in gangs and caught up in drugs, etc. So very early on, he decided that the key to keeping the family safe and to hope that his boys were not going to end up in the same steel factory that he was working in, he decided he was going to turn them into serious musicians. But remember, these were very young boys at this time. So the routine that would happen in this household, so first of all, the 2-bedroom household, parents lived in 1 bedroom. In the other bedroom, the 6 boys shared the room. The 3 girls slept on couches, pull-out couches in the living room. So it was a very tight family group. And again, very religious because of Catherine's profound belief in Jehovah's Witness. So the end result was how they saved their children. They'd come home from school, they'd be given a little quick lunch, and then Joe would take over the boys and try to turn them into a group, which he named very early on the Jackson 5. But keep in mind, there was so much discipline involved in this. Joe would sit in the room with his belt in his hand. And if someone missed a note, if someone missed a dance step, they were beaten. So Michael Jackson had this fear of his father from a very early age. Watch how brilliantly this is developed in the musical. Let me just pause and tell you that the musical is set in 1992. Michael Jackson is already an enormous star by this point, and he's planning his Dangerous World Tour. He wants to raise millions of dollars for poor children around the world. So he's at the height of his powers. The story is told basically as a series of flashbacks. The given circumstance in the musical is it's set in a rehearsal days before the Dangerous Company is going out on tour, and it will be a world tour that would begin in Munich, Germany. And again, this is a stadium tour, so we're talking about sending equipment in a 747. It would take 64 buses to move all of the equipment. It would take a staff of 80 people to present the show. So this is an enormous project. And so there's a tremendous amount of pressure in these days before they're ready to open in Munich. And you see the influence of Michael Jackson's past because we have a series of flashbacks in the story. The story is told really like the Moon Dance. If you remember, in the Moon Dance, you take a couple of steps forward and then you slide back. So as they're rehearsing, that's the given circumstance of the show, getting the show ready to open. And so we get to see Michael's artistry and the extreme demands he placed on himself and the entire company to pull off this enormous production. And again, Michael was always in conflict with himself. He always had to be better than he was, better than his last tour, better than his last album. But when you create an album like Thriller, which is the biggest selling album ever, when you create over 500 million records being sold, this is a lot of competition. But all of it stems from his memory of his father. So watching the show, so what's so clever about the show, Lynn Nottage is the book writer. Lynn Nottage is a playwright I profoundly admire. She has a wonderful history in terms of the theater, writing very interesting plays. Intimate Apparel is probably her most successful and popular play. It's about a black woman who created in the 19th century, who created clothes for wealthy women. It's a beautiful study in the issue of black and white and what it means to be black in America. She's won 2 Pulitzer Prizes, the only playwright ever to do that, for 2 plays, one called Ruined, which was about life in Africa and the horrible circumcision rituals that happened to women in Africa, and then another brilliant play called Sweat, which is a play about working in the factories. So she is a woman, a black woman, who is very tuned in to what it means to be black in America, and she writes with great compassion, great insight, great intellect, and so she's really the perfect person to do this story. She sets the story in 1992 as they're preparing to take the show on the road, and we have a series of flashbacks. So we have 3 Michael Jacksons: the tiny boy who was the original star of the Jackson 5 when he was 10 years old, the sort of teenage Michael Jackson who became a sort of teen idol, and then the Michael Jackson we knew as an adult. But watch how cleverly the flashbacks happen. I mean, once you do one flashback, the audience says, okay, it's a flashback now, and that becomes predictable. But it's done so cleverly. They happen so organically, they happen so naturally, that in the middle of a rehearsal, something will trigger a memory from Michael Jackson and will go back in his past. The great design that was created in the way they structured the story, the way Lynn Nottage structured the story, is that the father, who is, sort of the villain of the past, he would, put a scar on Michael Jackson that would last all of his life. Michael lived in fear of his father all of his life. When he finally left the group in 1979, it took him so long to do that because he was afraid of the confrontation of dealing with his father. But finally, after that point, he thought he was free of his father. But as you will see in this story, his father dominates his entire life. But what's wonderful in the casting is the director of the concert that is going to happen is played by the same actor who plays the father when we go into the past. The stage manager of the show that we're watching being rehearsed, it's a backstage musical, so the stage manager that we watch when we do other flashbacks will be Berry Gordy, who was the creator of Motown, who really was the one who turned the Jackson 5 into international celebrities. So watch for that double casting. Look at your program carefully. Also the role of the mother, Catherine, she becomes a backup singer in the story that we see. So all of the double casting works brilliantly, and it expedites the way we can move into these flashbacks and memory sequences. So in any case then, what happens in the story as you see it, when you walk into the theater about 10 minutes before the show begins, you see on the stage what is a rehearsal hall. And it looks like a rehearsal hall for a dance studio. And you watch people coming in one at a time, the dancers, the musicians, the technicians, and we see them talking together. It's wonderfully done. It's very authentically done. I spent my life in rehearsal halls, so when I watch that scene, you know, I can smell the sweat of the rehearsal hall when you watch it. It's so lifelike and real. But it sets the stage for the idea that we, the audience, are going to be part of watching this show being put together and seeing the genius of Michael Jackson. So Lynn Nottage made very interesting choices. This is one of the only I think it is the only musical I can think of where there isn't a love story. Always we have, you know, some kind of love story, and love songs dominate the music. In this case, it's Michael's love for performing that is the love story we're going to see. And then we see all of the demons he has, and that memory of his father with that belt standing there saying, if you make a mistake, you know, you're going to be punished for it. And of course, Michael Jackson does that to himself as an adult, and you will see the extraordinary way in which he pushes everyone to the absolute limit to make it happen. You know, in my life, I had the opportunity of working with several great artists, and I would stage concerts for them when they were going on the road. And it's interesting to watch some artists do this with great joy, like, I want to share my music with you. Other artists do it with great pain. No one did it with more pain than Michael Jackson did. And that, of course, you know, came from the earliest upbringing of, it's got to be perfect. Okay, so in the story, in his life, how his life then impacts what you see, his father then would take these boys, when we go to our own flashback for a moment, and they'd come home from school, they would work for hours, they would have a very quick supper, and then they would perform locally at, you know, little clubs in the area, at school dances. And very quickly, when they started to realize that they were really professional, they started going to Chicago every day, which is, you know, about an hour and a half drive into the city from where they lived. And they would perform every night, sometimes in very sleazy bars, sometimes in strip clubs. But these boys would perform until after midnight. Then they'd be driven home, sleeping in the car on the way home, put to bed, and sent to school the next morning. And that was their life. So they had no childhood. You know, it's so interesting when all the media gets very dark about Michael Jackson, and we hear all those stories about him wanting young boys to come and have sleepovers with him at Neverland. In a way, there's a great sadness about this, because in a way, it's sort of like his lost innocence and lost childhood that he never got to have. Okay, so in any case, they finally are asked to perform at the Apollo Theater in right outside of New York, and it's a very famous place in Harlem where they have an amateur night. But it's the most ruthless audience, and if the audience at the Apollo, mostly an African-American audience, if black groups would come in and they weren't top-notch, they'd be booed off the stage. I mean, this was a tough audience. And so the night that the Jackson 5 appeared there, Michael Jackson said, you know, he's like 10 years old. It was the only time in his life that he wasn't terrified to go on stage, because he felt confident that they would love them. And of course they did. And that was the beginning of their career. That was the single most important performance they gave. You will see it wonderfully done in a flashback in the show. And then they came to be noticed by Motown and by Berry Gordy. And Berry Gordy, of course, would transform them into an international group. As you remember with Motown, Berry Gordy would take a young unknown girl like Diana Ross and her team, the Supremes, and turn them, into the ultimate celebrities of the day. And Berry Gordy did this with countless artists. And Motown, really in the 60s and early 70s was the ultimate place. It had a whole new sound for music. It was like a school when people were accepted there, when the Jackson 5 went there. I mean, they had people that helped them deal with dance, with deportment, with how to wear costumes, with what to look like, with what to say in interviews. I mean, it was this sort of whole school. And the families all lived together, but Berry Gordy always made them work in competition. So every week when they decided which song was going to get a lot of attention or might get recorded, they're competing against one another, and then Berry Gordy would decide which was the best song of the week and pursue it. And it was a device that worked brilliantly. So he would make the Jackson 5 celebrities. Watch that whole influence in those flashbacks. And again, the actor playing Berry Gordy is spectacular, and we really see the power of an impresario and how they're able to shape a talent. So in 1979 then, Michael Jackson decided that he really wanted to go on his own. And again, you're saying to the person who created you that I'm going to go beyond, I want to do my own thing. Berry Gordy never allowed the groups to write their own music, to make their own choices. He always made all of the creative choices, and Michael Jackson was ready to do that. So in 1979, he would go to New York, where he appeared in the movie The Wiz. While the movie was not very successful, it starred Diana Ross. She actually was much too old to play the role. She was really quite beautiful in the film. But Michael Jackson is really the star of the film. He plays the Scarecrow. And it was a very defining moment for him when he could be an individual artist doing something on his own. And he really scored as an actor, as a dancer, and as a singer. So sometime, if you've never seen The Wiz, take the opportunity to go back and see a young Michael Jackson really being born. He then would go on and he would create a new relationship then with Quincy Jones. And Quincy Jones was the greatest music impresario of the day. And it would be Michael Jackson who would break down all of these black barriers that existed. I mean, remember, this was still a period when black artists recorded that they were only played on black radio stations. And to move into the white world of music was very complicated. And Michael Jackson would be one of the pioneers who would do that brilliantly with, of course, the help of Quincy Jones. They would create 3 brilliant albums, Off the Wall, Thriller, and Bad. Again, with Thriller being the largest selling record ever. So, Michael Jackson was very lucky. As a little boy, the first time he left his hometown of Gary, Indiana, which is a very modest place. He went to Detroit, but they all lived in the same house when they worked at Motown. So the first big adventure they had was when they went on their first airplane ride to Los Angeles. They were put in the Beverly Hills Hotel in suites, and Diana Ross made them breakfast every morning. So how does it get better than that to start your career? So he always lived in this sort of fantasy world. I went through many of his most famous biography is called Moonwalk. It was edited by Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, incidentally. And it's a really stunning account. And he talks about the idea, and I always want you to be aware of this dichotomy. There is the private Michael Jackson and the public Michael Jackson. And of course, that public Michael Jackson on stage is so polished and perfected, first by his father, then by Berry Gordy, then by Quincy Jones, and then by himself. So it's this very polished persona. And offstage, we have this very shy boy. In his autobiography, he writes about the idea that when he's on the road, think about it, when they did the Dangerous tour, which is the basis of the tour we're watching as they're preparing it, he would ultimately play to 3.5 million people. And every night he went home and cried because he felt so lonely and disconnected from his family. He had no friends. There are these millions of people who adored him, but no one to really call a friend in private. So it's a very pathetic story in many ways, and it's wonderfully developed in this musical. And even though the book writer, is very smart by setting it in 1992, because remember, all of the sexual accusations happen right after this. And then he marries, Lisa Marie Presley, and then he has these children, and then his life becomes increasingly bizarre. He creates a fantasy home for himself, Neverland, where there's a Ferris wheel, etc. And he invites underprivileged children to come and play in the public grounds that he has. It's an extraordinary tale. But happily, we don't deal with that darkness in the musical. We really deal with the public and private side of Michael Jackson. And the most important part of the musical is we see into the genius of Michael Jackson and what he does. I mean, you will see in the story that they keep saying you're going over budget, you can't spend any more money on this. You're adding, the costume budget is now $2 million, and you want to add all these special effects. One of the things you'll keep hearing about in the story is he wants to add a device that's called a toaster. And they talk about this quickly, and you may not understand what it is. A toaster means that the actor will make a star entrance. And so it happens from below the stage. Suddenly they fill the stage with smoke, and they open the stage floor, and they shoot him out of the stage floor. So, he flies in the air, and then hopefully the stage floor closes so that when he lands, he's all right. It's a very dangerous device, and he wants to use it, and they keep saying, no, you can't. You will see it used at the end of the show, so watch for it when he goes to the stadium. The show literally ends when he steps on the stage to begin the Dangerous tour. But I do want to tell you, again, only an old nerd could tell you this, but the idea of the toaster came from the Middle Ages. And they used to have these pageant wagons, they called them, and they'd move them out into the town square, and people would perform doing mystery plays and morality plays. In the Middle Ages. They do it very often in front of a cathedral. And one of the big devices when you had the devil appear, they would, again, do something to disguise the stage floor, move the floor away, and they'd shoot him out on a spring device so he appeared. There were examples of of them not opening the trap and the actor being crushed by, the weight of the spring that sent him out. So it is a dangerous device. And it's talked about briefly in the show, but interesting. And Michael Jackson was willing to sacrifice all of his financial success to put all the money into these shows. In the Dangerous tour, it ends with the moment he starts the tour, but I just want you to know that during the run of the tour, it would play in 67 cities. It would play through Europe, in Asia, and the last performance was in Mexico City. They had to end the tour early because Michael Jackson was addicted at this point to painkillers because of the incident that happened. You remember when he made the Pepsi commercial, they used pyrotechnic effects, which you will see played out in the musical. and he had severe scalp burns. And so he took Demerol to control the pain from the damaged scalp and all of the surgeries that had to happen to correct it. So he had to end that performance. It would make over $100 million. It grossed the largest in Bucharest. They filmed it. You can see the film of the Dangerous Tour. It would be fun to do after you see the musical. It's available on YouTube. They filmed it, and they paid the filming company $20 million. At the time, it was the largest amount of money ever paid for a concert being filmed. And then again, so much of this went back to charity. It was his good friend Elizabeth Taylor who would help him when he came home from that tour. He felt defeated. I mean, even though it was triumphant, even though 3.5 million people adored it, he wasn't able to complete the tour. And he felt he had disappointed his charity where he was raising money for children. But it was Elizabeth Taylor who would help him go into therapy and go to the Betty Ford Center, et cetera. So it's a tormented life. And it's a life that was led always in the spotlight. I mean, keep in mind, how do you deal with this little boy who sang in this incredible falsetto, who then became a young teen idol, who had to sing in sort of lyric tenor, and then he became, the ultimate superstar that he was. He had to make all of these transitions, these artistic transitions, in front of millions of people. And so, this spirit that Michael Jackson had of being a perfectionist would stay with him all of his life. And of course, it was the legacy that his father gave him. So you're in for a very special treat. It's a well-conceived show. Michael Wheeldon, the choreographer, is one of my favorite choreographers. He did An American in Paris that many of you remember seeing. He creates stunning visuals on stage. His background is in ballet, and so he understands how to fill an empty space with magic, with the bodies of the dancers and then lighting and special effects. So the show is loaded with all kinds of visual eye candy for you. It's spectacular. So I hope you will enjoy your moonwalk with Michael Jackson. Thank you.